Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and in today's tutorial we're going to talk all about hand-dyed or hand-painted yarn skeins. Now these are the skeins that we have in our stash because we love the way they look, or we found them at a festival, or we bought them from our local yarn shop. But we're not quite sure how they're going to knit up, and there's just so many names that get tossed around with hand-dyed or hand-painted yarn skeins, so how in the world do you tell them apart and know what you're going to get when you pick up any given skein? So I think we should head over to the yarn desk. I've got a bunch of different samples over there, and we're going to talk about the different terminology that's used and then some of the ways that these hand-dyed or hand-painted skeins may knit up for you. Now this is not a definitive guide. There are plenty of other variations out there in the world, but this should give you a good head start on figuring out what you have in your stash or what you want to buy the next time you go out to a festival or your local yarn store. So let's get started. So here we are over at the yarn room desk, and as you can see, I've pulled out a bunch of different examples for us to talk about. These are hand-dyed skeins with a couple of exceptions, and those exceptions are going to help us understand a little better about what might be happening with the hand-dyed skeins versus like a large commercial yarn producer. I also have some hand-spun here, lots of different fabric and swatches and examples of fabric knit up, so we're going to look at the yarn, and first I do think we should go through a little bit of terminology, because as I talk through these yarns, I want you to know what I'm saying and to know about the terminology in the community that will help you kind of navigate the kinds of yarns that you might see out there. And I think this is particularly helpful if you're new to crafting with yarn and you've heard a lot of these terms before and you're not quite sure what they mean. So let's just quickly look through them so that we can have a kind of solid foundation before we jump into the yarn. Now I've put these in a kind of order that works in my brain. You may have a different order in your brain, and that's absolutely fine, but I've worked from a kind of solid yarn through some yarn that's going to have some variation to a kind of self-striping or self-patterning yarn. So the solid yarns are the ones that you might think to yourself of first when you first start knitting. If you're going to go pick up a yarn at a big box store, you're very likely going to pick up one and say, a blue is a blue. Look, it's blue or it's green. It's a very solid color, looks pretty uniform. That's a solid. And indeed it is. This nature spun is a wonderful yarn for socks, but it's not a hand-dyed yarn and not a lot of variation here. So that's one of our outliers over there. And all the way at the other end, self-patterning yarn, you might see something like Schockmeyer's Regia yarn, and it knits up into these socks that actually they pattern. I mean, the yarn does the work for you. You just knit the sock and it will create this pattern on the sock. Now there are indie dyers that do that work. It is incredibly time consuming and elaborate, but this is our other outlier. This was machine made, and that's why it has the ability to have all of that patterning in it. So on either end of our list here, we have yarn that is usually going to be produced by a larger commercial outfit. So if you're looking at a self-patterning yarn or a solid yarn, something that really does look really uniform, you're most likely not looking at hand-dyed yarn. Now everything else in the middle here is fair game for hand-dyed yarn. So let's talk through a few of them. We have semi-solid and tonal, which are often interchangeable. We'll talk about a slight difference there. There's gradient yarns, which move from one color to other colors. These are sometimes called ombre yarns. We have variegated yarns, which are like the wild childs of the yarn world. They have all kinds of different things going on in them, and they look beautiful in the skein, but the fabric tends to work up in unexpected ways. Let's just put it that way. So that's variegated. Speckled is usually a yarn that has a fairly plain background, a gray or a white or something like that, but it has pops of color that have been kind of thrown on the yarn when it's in the dye bath. Self-striping yarn, that's going to be again very time consuming, but there are hand dyers that make self-striping yarn. They do a really amazing job. That yarn will create stripes without you ever having to cut a skein and introduce a new skein. It just automatically stripes on itself. Most of these skeins are going to be dyed up so that they work on a small circumference. So things like socks or mittens or something like that. Very rarely will a self-striping yarn be dyed in such a way that the circumference would work for a sweater or any kind of larger project. Okay, so we have some terminology down now, and we've talked about either end of this spectrum where you're less likely to find hand-dyed yarn. Let's turn back to the yarns, and I've laid them out in the same order as the list. So we go from solid all the way over to self-patterning yarn, and we've already talked about these two on the ends as our outliers. So I'm going to turn those kind of sideways because they're not hand-dyed yarns, but they help us see the kind of array of what's possible with hand-dyed yarns. And the cool thing is that there's a place for all yarns. Let's just remember that. So there's absolutely a place for the solid color yarns that you would buy from a bigger manufacturer, and there's an awesome place for self-patterning yarns, and then there's lots and lots of fun stuff to be done with hand-dyed yarns in between. So all yarns are useful to us. Let's not forget that. It should be said right off the bat. But we're just looking at the differences among these hand-dyed yarns today. So let's turn our attention over here to what I'm going to call a semi-solid, and Stephanie of Space Cadet it's a great resource trying to explain some of the differences between solids, semi-solids, and tonal yarns, and I'll put her link to her blog post below. So Stephanie of Space Cadet calls semi-solids the solids of the hand-dyeing yarn world, because her argument is that if you're dyeing yarn using hand-dyed processes, you really can't get a perfectly solid yarn like a bigger company can. And that, she argues, it's because the bigger companies dye their yarn in the wool or in the fleece first, and then, you know, card it all together so it gets redistributed and then gets made into yarn, so you get a much more uniform kind of coloration of the yarn that you don't necessarily get if you just are dyeing the yarn itself, not the fleece or the fiber. So a huge thank you to Stephanie of Space Cadet for explaining that. She also does a great job explaining tonal yarns, and we'll get to that in just a second. So this SweetGeorgia yarn, I'm going to argue, is a hand-dyed yarn that is semi-solid. And sure, it looks pretty uniform from a distance, and if you were to knit it up into a sweater or an accessory, you would get the basic sense that this is a greenish kind of color, right? And if you look a little closely at the actual yarn, though, in the light, you can see that there's slight variations. So this is slightly lighter over here and slightly darker right there. Or if you were to open this up a little bit, you might find that there's a slightly lighter bit over here than this. Overall, it looks as solid as it could be, but it is technically a semi-solid. So let's look at what that might look like in the fabric. And I don't have a swatch of this exact one, but I have a swatch of some other semi-solids. So for example, this one, which is a very deep purple, looks like a solid yarn, and yet if you get down into it, you can see that there's a variation here, and you can almost see it better on the edging. This is more of a plum purple, this is more of a like violet-y purple, and so there's a slight variation in this yarn, even though it looks relatively solid. So I would call this a semi-solid, and that's likely what you're going to get if you were to knit up a semi-solid skein. Something that looks relatively uniform, but that if you looked closely, you would see some variation in the color of the yarn itself. Okay, let's move on over to the tonals. And what I have for you as an example is a Madeline Tosh vintage in the color white Nectar. Again, this looks like, you know, overall you'd give this like, you'd say it was like a salmon-y kind of color, maybe a peachy pinky kind of color. But the deal is that it has some different tones within the yarn. So I'm going to refer back to Stephanie of Space Cadet here because she explained it in a way that I could actually understand it, so maybe it'll help you as well. Tonal yarn basically takes a hue, like a central basic color, like a red or a blue or a yellow or a green or something like that. And if you add white to part of that color, you'll get lighter and lighter tints. And if you add black or gray to that color, you'll get different shades of that color. And if you were to create a yarn that took advantage of the different shades and tints of that yarn, that's a tonal yarn. So it's kind of like taking one color and going into the darker side of that color and the lighter side of that color. And you can see that here with this particular yarn. You have little bits in here that are a kind of darker, almost to a gray peach. or salmon kind of color. And then you have these lighter bits, which almost look like the color has been taken out of the yarn. So a tonal yarn has that variation across kind of lighter versions of a color and then darker versions of a color. So let's look at an example of a tonal yarn here in our swatches. And we have this one here, which is a blue version of a tonal yarn, and you can see that it has lighter blues and darker blues that are kind of making up the fabric here. So you're going to get some more variation than you would have had from semi-solid. I'll put them next to each other. So you see the semi-solid actually looks pretty solid compared to the tonal yarn, right? But this tonal yarn has some different variations from a darker blue to a lighter blue. So let's move on to gradient yarns. And gradient yarns are going to be put up in a couple of different ways. You might find them in a skein that looks like this. So you can kind of see that there's a piece here, it kind of moves into different colors. Now, if they're in the skein, you probably need to open them up to confirm that it's actually a gradient rather than something else. So we'll open that one up in just a second. Gradients also come like this so that you can see the color change. This one you could pull from the outside, has a little loop down here, or from the inside, depending on where you wanted to start your project. So this one moves from a beautiful blue to a green to a gold to a brown. And this one here, as I mentioned before, this is my own hand spun. This one moves from, you can see, kind of light peach into a lighter orange, darker orange, and then to almost like a burnt umber kind of this way. And this one, like I said, when you open up the skein, you can see that as you knit, you'd be knitting this portion first, then your color would transition into this other color, then it would transition and transition and transition. So your fabric would end up looking, depending on your circumference, would end up looking like the actual yarn. It would have a peach, it wouldn't be quite stripes, but it would have a peach kind of portion, a light yellow portion, a darker yellow portion, and then this brownish kind of portion. And you can see even within this particular yarn, because it is hand spun, there's variation. This is like a tonal on the end here. It's a very tonal final colorway to this particular yarn. So the other way that gradients will come is in mini skeins or in a pack like this. This is from Knit Crate, and you'll see that this one has goes from lighter to darker to darker to darker. Now these yarns in this particular pack are not hand dyed. These are from a bigger commercial outfit, but I just wanted to give you a sense that gradient yarns can come packaged like this. Like SweetGeorgia often offers like a gradient pack of yarn in different colors. So I don't have a swatch for you, but as I mentioned with the hand spun yarn over here, this is how the fabric would actually work up. You would have this kind of movement between one color into the next, into the next. And they're kind of related, I guess, in a way to self-striping yarns, because the color changes happen because the yarn color actually shifts as you're knitting. You're not really actually doing anything. You're just working the yarn, and you're going to get this color shift from a lighter to a darker or darker to a lighter. All right, let's look at some variegated yarn. This is kind of like the star of the hand dyed world. This is Hedgehog Fibers, for example, and these variegated skeins come in all shapes and sizes. Oftentimes they're superwash, but not always, and they are a riot of color. You can see in this one we have white, pink, purple, green, blue, there's probably, I think there's even a little yellow, a little orange. I mean, there's just every color in here. It's really quite beautiful to look at in the skein. And it's very different from this gradient where all the color is organized, or these tonals, which are focused on one particular hue and just variations in that hue, or a semi-solid, which looks so different to that variegated yarn, right? The variegated yarn is beautiful in part because it has all these different colors in it. But the question is always, how is it going to knit up? What's it going to look like? What am I supposed to do with this? And that is kind of the perennial question for knitters. So I have a couple of examples of how a variegated yarn might knit up. We have, for example, a pair of socks here. This is actually in Miss Babs. I think it was a Yummy 2-ply. I think it was called Rocket, something like that. And you can see that you can get color pooling in lots of different ways with variegated yarns, depending on how they were dyed and depending on the circumference of the thing that you're knitting. So since I was knitting a sock, I ended up getting these kind of almost stripes on the upper portion, and then this kind of pooling happening on the lower portion of the socks. That's one example for you. Another example is a shawl that I knit up from Old Crow Art Yarns. This was a beautiful variegated skein, and you can use these variegated skeins not just for socks but for shawls too. So this shawl is a riot of colors, and a lot of people use colors like this and they kind of break it up. So they'll choose a shawl pattern that has different stripes of maybe a more neutral, more semi-solid color in between the kind of variegated colors, just to do something different with it. In my case, I tried to use a shawl with a stitch pattern that would pool the colors in some interesting ways, and I think you can see that there's some texture to the pattern, and because of that it kind of started to pool the yarns in certain ways. Other people will use patterns where you could do like intentional pooling. All kinds of fun things can be done with variegated yarn. You can even make sweaters out of them. People love making sweaters out of variegated yarns. You just have to kind of plan for it in your patterning. Now over here in all my other swatches, there's tons of fun variegated yarn. This is actually the same yarn that I made the socks out of. You can see it looks a little bit different in this particular configuration, but it's the same kind of idea. And here's another variegated yarn that knits up very differently. You almost get striping given the size of this particular swatch. Pull up one more for you. This is a very variegated yarn, and it has lots of greens and pinks in it, and it just came up as a kind of riot of color in that particular swatch. So variegated yarns are fun, but you have to plan ahead and kind of think about what kind of project you want to use them for, because they do have a kind of mind of their own. That's how I like to think of them. They do their own thing, and you have to just kind of roll with it a little bit. So let's move on to a speckled yarn. This one over here is from Dye Candy in the UK, and as I mentioned early on, speckled yarns often have a pretty plain base. So this one has a very white background or base, and it just has like speckles thrown on. Just, little pops of color here and there. They can be kind of riotous, like a variegated yarn skein. So this one does have greens and purples and blues all over the place. And it could also be a really subdued skein where it's mostly white or gray or black, and then it just has tiny little pops of color on it. So let me show you a shawl that I knit up in Purl and Ply's version of a speckled yarn. And this one, I think you can see, has a very beautiful gray base. So there's this kind of lilac-y gray base. And then every once in a while you get one of these crazy pops of color. So in this particular yarn, the pops of color were some darker purple. Sometimes there was a little hint of a blue-green, kind of turquoise there. But overall, the effect of the shawl in this particular pattern, this is again, has some texture to it to kind of break up whatever's going on in the yarn. The overall effect is that you have this kind of muted background, but you have these little pops of color coming through on the fabric. So that is a speckled yarn, and that's this guy looks pretty much like a speckled to me. There are different variations of speckled though. Like I said, some will have more or less speckly color on them. So let's move on to our self-striping yarn, and the example I have here is from Biscotte Yarns, which is a Canadian company. I have another of their cakes over here. That's the gradient example that I gave you. So they do gradients and self-striping yarn. And as I mentioned before, self-striping yarn is a labor of love. It's pretty labor intensive hand dye to do. And if you open up the skein, so if we were to put this on the Swift and start winding it into a cake, you would notice that kind of like a gradient, you're going to have a bunch of time and yardage with like this particular color. Then the skein, as you're winding it into your cake, will switch over to this particular color. It'll be red for a little while, and then it'll switch to the blue, and then back to the gray, and so on and so forth. So a self-striping skein is going to have enough yardage at a particular circumference to create stripes in your small circumference objects. And I say small circumference because they're generally dyed so that they're going to work with something like socks or a mitten or something like that. So I have an example here of the self-striping happening, and this is a regular old sock ribbing, and if you cast on at the top, working down, you can see that what I've got here are the stripes created by the yarn. I didn't do anything here. I didn't break off any colorways and add any colorways in. It just does it by itself. And in this particular yarn, it's set up to have, you know, a larger repeat of the red, a smaller stripe of the white, then a larger stripe of the blue, and on and on and on. So each self-striping yarn is going to work differently, and oftentimes with self-striping yarns, you can look at a company's website and they will have swatched up the yarn, or they'll have sock examples that will show you how the yarn looks when it's striped, because some will have, you know, wider stripes, some will have narrower stripes, some will have all kinds of mix of different kinds of stripes. So that's what a self-striping yarn will do. So we've worked through our tour of hand-dyed yarns all the way from the semi-solids to the tonals, the gradients, the variegated, the speckled, and the self-striping. And I do want to spend just a minute here talking about what you'd get with the things that you might find on either end. So we talked a little bit about the solids here, and I wanted to show you, for example, I have a sock here that I knit up in the Nature Spun. This is just in one of their gray colorways. And I think you can see, after seeing all the differences and the kind of fun variation of hand-dyed yarns, that this one is pretty darn solid looking. So it doesn't have variation in the colors, really. It's pretty uniform across the entire sock, and that is what you're going to get with some of these more commercial operations where they're able to dye the fleece or the wool ahead of time and then create the yarn afterwards. And let me give you a quick example. Another sock that was knit out of the self-patterning yarn. These were also knit out of the Regia, just a different colorway. And you can see, I think, that beyond just self-striping, you get a little bit of patterning depending on the circumference of your object. So here we have some of these little patterns going on, and it's kind of like slightly different than the striping, because you're getting patterning going on within your stripes. So that's what a self-patterning yarn from a commercial company will look like when it's knit up. So let's look back at our terminology one more time, and hopefully by this point you have a better sense of what's out there and what's available. From the outliers, the solids and the self-patterning yarns that are generally created by bigger commercial outfits, to all of these different kinds of hand-dyed yarns in the middle here that offer all kinds of different and unique properties for the hand knitter or the crafter who wants to use these yarns. Now, some of you might have noticed that I had tweed down here on the list, and that is it's probably a yarn for an entirely different conversation, but I just wanted to bring it up here to say that this effect that you see with the tweedy, the neps or the noils that are created in the yarn, do create a very particular color effect sometimes with knitting, and they can be made both by hand spinners, by commercial spinners, and they can be used by hand dyers as a base. So tweeds are, I'm just going to call them a separate animal and come back to them in a future tutorial, but I wanted to include them here since we're talking about some of the ways that hand-dyed yarns can do different things with color and play around with the effects that you get with their yarn. So thanks for taking the tour through hand-dyed yarns with me. I hope that some of that terminology will help, and seeing the yarns in the skein and then seeing how they might knit up will give you a better sense of what you might get when you're faced with another beautiful skein of yarn at a festival or a yarn shop, or even from your own stash. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.